And Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, has hinted repeatedly that he'd like to introduce more tax cuts or further tax cuts. The latest today, BBC News, Hunt considers national insurance cuts at budget. We've already had some, and now it looks as if he's considering further cuts. But the response from the Institute for Fiscal Studies in The Guardian, experts warn Hunt over dubious case for unfunded budget tax cuts. Can we afford tax cuts, Tom?
Well, I think we've got the tax burden at the moment is far too high. I think the government's been responsible with tax cuts it has delivered. I think the Prime Minister's made clear that his priority is to bring down.
I mean, you have a good history of responsible tax cuts. I don't want to bring out the lettuce again, but even then, why would you be doing tax cuts at a time in which our public services are really underfunded and not working at all at the moment? When you look at polling, Lord Ashcroft has done polls on this very specifically, on the question of if there is extra fiscal headroom, quote unquote. Not a concept I like, but let's assume we use the IFS's model for fiscal headroom. If there is extra fiscal headroom, would you like it to be spent on tax cuts for people like the person surveyed? Would it be on extra spending or bringing down the deficit? Even Tory voters overwhelmingly chose that they wanted it spent on public services. Tax cuts and deficit reduction, not a part of an issue as far as they're concerned. Their main concern was extra funding for public services, and that's Tory voters. When it was Lib Dem or Labour voters, like a massive supermajority in favour of extra funding for public services. So there is entirely unified political will throughout the political spectrum to just put extra fiscal headroom into public services. And the Tories won't do that. They think a tax cut bribe, is enough to win them the next election, or to not get trounced in the next election, when they don't even know what their own voters want when it comes to this. Because at the end of the day, most people use the NHS. Most people send their kids to school. Most people want to go and see a dentist. And all of these things are going to require state funding to be able to get to the kind of standard where people aren't going to blame the government for their failure. And they haven't funded them, and they failed, and people are blaming the government. I think, well, if we cut some taxes, then maybe we'll be able to get through this. I mean, you're not going to cut taxes enough for someone to be able to send their children to another school, or to suddenly be able to afford private healthcare, which is the only way they'd be able to solve other than putting money into those public services. It's complete nonsense politics, if anything. Obviously, it's nonsense economics. We know it's nonsense economics. We've gone through that a lot on this channel. But it's also really stupid politics, and that's why it's just completely insane to me that they go along with this line of trying to woo people with tax cuts. It doesn't make any sense.
Down inflation before we...
But my question is, are they affordable? You've got the Institute for Fiscal Studies saying you'd have to spell out how they'd be paid for.
And today I saw some coverage of some of the ways that they might do that. I saw something a vape.
Okay.
I saw, but ultimately I do think that the Chancellor is responsible, and I don't think he'd do tax cuts if it wasn't in a responsible way. But we've got to spur the economy. We've got to get some growth, and one of the ways to do that is through sensible tax cuts.
Well, is it? Is that what it will do, Mariana? Tax cuts, let's say further cuts to national insurance. We already had 2p cut to national insurance that came in last month. Would it spur on growth, and is it affordable?
Well, first of all, it makes no sense to look at tax on its own. The first thing is you want to look at the economy and what we require for the economy, so public investment and private sector investment. There's a current massive gap on the infrastructure investment that's required, on the health gap spending around 50 billion in terms of the NHS gap. There's a massive net zero gap if we actually want to go towards net zero, which you'll remember Cameron was saying we had to do. And so then we require money for that. Now, if you just look at the short-term spending, that could look like a rise in the deficit. But if we're not actually investing, public and private sector, then you'll remember from basic maths, x over 0 is infinity. So even with a low deficit, as long as your long-run GDP is not growing, then that ratio can keep rising. And in terms of tax, details matter, right? So the real tax change I think we need in this country, for example, is on capital gains. All the investments I just talked about.
Equalising it with income tax?
Well, what you want to do currently it's very low. What you want to do is not just think about the tax rate, you want to think about the details. So to get long-term investment, the tax reduction for capital gains should be dependent on how long the investment is made, whereas what happened in this country actually under Labour, this was one of their mistakes, was we reduced the time that private equity, for example, had to be invested from 10 years to 2 years to get a capital gains tax.
All right, well, look, Mariana, you've given us the sort of big picture on...
tax is not any higher in this country than the rest of the OECD.
Well, OK, and there are comparisons
to... bill is not...
When she's absolutely right. At the end of the day, we don't have a tax problem. Our tax burden isn't actually that high internationally when you look at the OECD, as she says. The biggest gap that we have is an investment gap. The reason why our economy is stagnant is because we haven't had productivity gains. The biggest impact on productivity gains is the lack of people who are economically active. And people aren't economically active because they're sick. The biggest group of people who are economically inactive are those who are off sick. And that's the reason for that is because we have gigantic NHS waiting lists because of 8 years of constant austerity from the Osborne and Hammond budgets, which hasn't had enough time since Johnson and Sunak put extra money into the NHS, even before the fact that there's still a deficit on what we should be spending on these things, to be able to bring those waiting lists down so people can get back to work and have those productivity gains. You're going to need to spend this money. Otherwise, we'll continue having anemic growth forever. And as she says, with those small and low growth figures because of lack of investment, even with tax cuts, even with budget cuts, for example, the overall debt to GDP ratio will still increase. Not that I think that's necessarily the metric that we should really be caring about. Mariana herself has done good work on the idea that debt to GDP ratios aren't really everything in terms of describing the health of the economy. Like, for a long time, we had a lower debt to GDP ratio than some other countries, which they were doing better than us. And when we had a higher debt to GDP ratio than Italy, they were seen as in economic shambles, whilst we were actually doing not so bad comparatively in terms of macro policy. So there's no link between high debt to GDP ratio and whether or not your economy is bad. That's not a thing that you can prove a link. That's never been proved empirically. So where are we spending the money? And I would say that tax cuts to people who don't need them, especially when it's only a small amount of tax cut that doesn't actually really look that substantial in real terms, in comparison to much extra spending into our public services, of which the failure of those has led to our lack of productivity growth, is a much smarter way of using quote-unquote fiscal headroom. Again, not a concept that I agree with, but let's just go with the kind of liberal capitalist framework on this one so people understand where the arguments, even under their own terms, fail.
But it's a record high for the UK at the moment, the overall tax burden. And that is the big picture. If we come in a bit narrower in terms of the policy.
No, the big picture isn't whether or not it's the highest for us. Is it the highest comparatively to other countries given on what we get back from the state? That's the issue. Most people don't really mind paying tax. They accept that's something they have to do. They wish they paid less, but they don't mind paying it in the abstract, as long as they get things back. The reason why people are frustrated at the moment isn't the fact that they're paying the tax. It's that public services still suck despite the fact that they're paying for them. That's why people are pissed off. Again, this is why when you ask them, do you want tax cuts? They're like, no, we just want public services that work. We don't care about tax cuts. We want our public services to work. We want to be able to send our kids to school and not worry about the roof collapsing.
Of tax cuts, since this is a decision that Jeremy Hunt is about to make. How important is it?
He's in a bind because if we weren't in an election year, I don't think we'd be having this conversation about tax cuts. And it is because the Conservatives are in such a bind in the polls that Jeremy Hunt needs to produce a fairly radical budget. He needs to have a few surprises. He needs to have a few things that will be seen as very popular. But on the other hand, if he is too radical, he risks doing another Kwasi Kwarteng, and he can't do that. He hasn't got the mentality to do that, I don't think.
Do you think it would spark the markets, just very briefly?
Well, again, it depends. So, for example, a reduction in many taxes, like corporate income tax, historically has just increased profits, not investment, right? So what you want is smart tax policy, which catalyzes investment in the economy.
True.
And if it's just a reduction in tax and doesn't actually expand the economy, then of course it's going to scare markets.
I think what he could do.
And that's the reason why Kwasi Kwarteng failed. They just assumed, without consulting anybody who was actually educated in this issue, they just assumed, well, if we cut tax for rich people, that will increase investment and create growth. When these people already have huge amounts of capitalization in the economy, and the extra profits that they make, as Mariana has already laid out here, doesn't get reinvested. Historically, we have the evidence to show this, as she said. If all of these rich people have all this extra money that they don't need to reinvest, it's just going to get shipped off to the Cayman Islands. It's going to go to Panama. Why do you think they'd reinvest it? There was no evidence for this reinvestment. And that's why the markets looked at the things that she was saying, because these are foremost rational actors. They're not political actors, they're rational actors. And thought, well, the growth that this theoretically should be paid for with hasn't been projected or is not going to actually appear in reality. And so we don't have confidence in the pound anymore. Whereas if you took that money instead of tax cuts and you spent it on investments into infrastructure, into production, into assets, into housing, that's a very clear way to both gain growth and gain returns for the exchequer that can then make sure the markets don't get spooked. John McDonnell was very clear on this when he was devising economic policies of the 2017 and 2019 manifestos. John John McDonnell was very clear, sitting down with industrial experts and saying, look, this is how we plan to pay for things. This is where we're going to make investments through fiscal expansion. There's no reason why the market should have any worry about being able to continually get returns on the bonds that they hold, because we've clearly shown where we're going to pay for it and where the growth is going to come from. Liz Truss didn't do this, and so the markets failed. So anybody who tries to tell you, oh, well, Corbyn would just have been another kind of Liz Truss, would collapse the economy, just doesn't understand how macroeconomics works and how markets work.
Is do something about so-called fiscal drag, where people on low and middle incomes are being forced into the next tax bracket.
Yes.
I think that has been a real problem, and that it's led to the fact we have the highest tax burden that we've had since the war. I believe in low taxes, but you can only cut taxes when it is affordable.
Right. I mean, Labour said it wants to cut the overall burden of taxes too on working people.
Absolutely, it's buying into the same picture.
It is.
And they should be
Is that
listening.
wrong?
I think they should be listening to Mariana, and she should be giving them advice on all of this. But I mean, I do think that this is election driven. Let's be very clear, and I think Ian's absolutely right. The reason why he's absolutely flailing around to look for tax cuts is because he wants to have something to say to the general public.
then-
and I'm afraid,
Well, if he's running that scared, why has Labour dropped its, or the figure of £28 billion a year investment in green policies?
Because they're little bitches. I hate to be crass, but that's the only reason they've dropped it, is because they're little bitches. Either because they are just neoliberals who didn't want to do it in the first place, or because they're running scared of the fact that Tories might attack them for having good policy. Because they can't defend policy on its merits anymore, because they can't be bothered setting narratives. They're just going to allow the Tories to set the narrative and then run with it, so that essentially the only person who has the power to set policy for the Labour Party is Rishi Sunak.
Well, I think that look, you're not talking to the right person, because I think that is being overcautious. But I mean, I suspect that
You think it's wrong? You think it was the wrong thing to do?
I do think that sometimes you have to be offering a bold thing, which will actually generate jobs, investment. The private sector will invest in this if they think government's investing in it.
10 trillion, by the way, 10 trillion, that's 12 zeros, is the market around kind of sustainability.
So
and renewable energy.
It's a figure
By
we
not
can't
being
even-
part of that global
It would
race.
draw in private money.
But as you say, they're
Well,
not committed to that
I
figure.
think it's about the fact that they know that they have to seem to be fiscally prudent, and that is their big
But there has to
priority
be
at
a
the moment.
difference between
Fiscal prudence is not when you don't spend money. This is the biggest lie of the last 45 years, that we equivocate fiscal prudence with spending less money. Fiscal prudence is about spending money well. And if you're not spending money on the things that it is necessary to spend money, you are by definition not being fiscally prudent. We're in the position where our public services are collapsing because we don't spend on them. And we're sitting around in our destroyed country going, well, at least we're fiscally prudent. And it's like, no, we haven't been. It's not fiscally prudent to look at your budget for repairing collapsing roofs in schools made out of crappy concrete and saying, well, we've not spent the money, this is fiscal prudence, as ceilings collapse on children's heads. This is not fiscal prudence, by the way. Just want to make it incredibly clear to everybody who ever watches this, from whatever spectrum of the political sphere that you rely on, right, whatever corner of the political spectrum that you're from, that anybody who thinks that fiscal prudence is when you don't spend money is just an absolute clown, just an idiot. Stop it.
Labour and
Wow.
the Conservatives. Keir Starmer can't rely on winning just by being fiscally prudent. He's got to show the electorate where the sunlit uplands are. They've ditched their main policy here.
They
and
haven't
haven't
ditched
repla-
it.
Well,
No,
they
no,
have.
no,
figure,
but
the
they've
figure.
ditched
And
the figure.
And they haven't
so
replaced
I
it
think
with
we've got to be
anything
clear.
else.
They've ditched the figure because they think the figure was going to give a gift to the other side to basically beat them with.
Well,
and
Exactly, they can't make positive arguments. Like, literally, if they could just go on Question Time, I've said this 1,000 times now, they should just go on these shows and just say, oh, well, how are you going to pay for it? It's coming from fiscal expansion and that's a good thing. End of discussion. End of discussion. Because that's it. That's the God's honest truth. If we don't change the narrative, change the mindset of the country away from this household budget nonsense and just admit and try and get people to understand that investment in infrastructure, capital investment coming from the state for returns for the state is a good thing, even if you have to borrow money or engage in fiscal expansion to do it, then we're lost. We're lost forever. Just give up on left-wing politics. Just join the Conservative Party and try and change them from within, because we're never going to get rid of neoliberalism. Like, why are you running for the Labour Party? Just run for the Conservative Party, be a one-nation Tory, and let's just leave it at that. If we don't believe that we can ever engage in fiscal expansion, or even win the argument politically that fiscal expansion is good de facto as long as it's invested well. Because if you just accept this household budget credit card nonsense, just join the Tories. There's no point. There's no point at all in this. Just be the new Theresa May. Because what's the difference? What, at any real utility, what is the difference between Theresa May and Keir fucking Starmer? There's nothing. At least Theresa May was pro-trans. At least she had that going for her. They're both as pro-Brexit as each other now.
So I think that they're still going to be sticking. They're going to be sticking with their intention, and I think that in meetings with the business world, that's what they're making clear.
They should also be reminding everyone that 10 years of Tory-run austerity reduced the social fabric in this country, as well as public investment.
Everything's crumbling.
The economic costs of inaction are much greater than the cost of action.
Right. Well, let's talk about the
short-term
let's talk about the infrastructure.
It's a long-term driver of growth.
There you go, exactly. Investment is a long-term driver of growth, and the failure of austerity is that we've paid more because austerity failed than we would if we just spent the money. It costs loads of money to replace a collapsed school roof than it costs to fix it whilst it's actually still upright. It's really simple economics. It's really simple, just logic, internal logic, that if you just leave your teeth to get screwed up, getting a checkup once in a while is much cheaper and more efficient than leaving it forever and ended up getting 3 root canals. I hate to use glib analogies rather than being more in-depth, but I think that's a really good analogy in the failure of austerity. They kept telling us that there were going to be these efficiency savings, and they never materialised. Go and watch how Britain destroyed its own economy by Yuri Shusford of Money and Macro, and he explains in detail how this efficiency austerity massively failed in creating economic growth, in actually shrinking the size of the state, because the debt-to-GDP ratio increased every year until 2018. It's just a political project that does not work and has never worked. Has never worked, ever. Waste of everybody's time, waste of everybody's breath. Let's just make some state investments using fiscal expansion, because that's how we did it for all of the years between 1945 and 1979, when we had sensible people in charge of our economy.
That you've just mentioned, because to go back to what the Institute for Fiscal Studies is saying, they want to know where the axe is going to fall. If Jeremy Hunt is going to say tax cuts in this budget, where is the axe going to fall on spending? Because presumably you're not going to fund it by extra borrowing. Well, where would you see the axe fall?
Well, I mean, as I said earlier on, we saw something today about vaping. That was one thing.
I think we're talking about broader spending departments.
In terms of spending.
Yes.
I don't know where we're going to be cutting spending. I want us to be cutting taxes in a responsible way, but the Chancellor, the tax burden is too high at the moment. But the key thing is, if you are going to cut taxes, you have to explain how you're going to pay for it. I honestly don't think even Keir Starmer knows himself about this £28 billion pledge. It changes week upon week.
Well,
and there's no point saying you're going to cut taxes, you're going to increase spending, you're going to do that £28 billion thing. Maybe you won't. No. But you've got absolutely no idea how you're going to pay for it.
But you're not sure whether the axe should.
Come on, Mariana, please just say fiscal expansion. Just say fiscal expansion. They were going to pay for it with fiscal expansion. It's fine. It would have been fine to do that. It's not a problem.
I mean, as an example, if you've got the protected departments of health, schools, international aid and defence, you are potentially leaving it to Labour to sort out.
No. I mean, you're leaving it. I mean, on the assumption that there's there will be a change of government, and I think there's a yearning for that. However, I do think that what the Conservatives will do is go to those areas that are easy to sell to the public, and yet the cost to the public is great. It will be in the Home Office and it will be in the Justice Department. Now, our justice system, and I say this as a lawyer, our justice system is absolutely in total disrepair. It's collapsing. The cases are not coming on for 3 and 4 years. Victims are suffering as a consequence of this.
Would Labour reverse tax cuts? Would Labour reverse tax cuts?
All I'm saying to you is this is where the Conservatives will go, and let me tell you, the general
I don't
public
think that's right. There is only one budget where you can make significant cuts, and it's the Department of Work and Pensions, because it has such a massive budget. Now, I'm not advocating that, but you can tinker around with the Ministry of Justice. It has a tiny budget compared to most other departments.
Spend on it.
But I think if they were to do that, it would be the DWP.
Well, we'll find out, and we've got a special programme here on Politics Live covering the budget on March the 6th.
They will take out of welfare because they hate poor people, and they have already stripped the welfare budget back so far that people from the UN have said that we're violating our international commitments to poverty reduction. I mean, this is not the first time the United Nations have told us that we're breaking international law with our failure to protect the vulnerable. So I'm entirely unsurprised, but just sick of this rhetoric that we just can't say fiscal expansion is good. We can't say public investment is good. We just have to continue running through the drain of tax cuts and spending cuts whilst the country kind of collapses in on itself. But the upper middle class people who vote Tory, they're happy, so who cares? Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for memberships. It's just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.